A steel barge is stuck in the rapids above Niagara Falls. It grounded there on the 6th of August, 1918, 600 meters from the brink, with 2 men aboard. Both lived. The obvious explanation is speed, and the speed is real. The current runs near 40 kilometers an hour. The obvious explanation is also wrong. Rescuers stood 300 meters away for most of a day and could only fire a rope. 4 Great Lakes drain through this one channel. Why does a river calm enough to picnic beside become inescapable? It happened in 1848, 1938, 1960, 2019, 2021. Start where the water starts, because the geography is the whole argument. Lake Erie sits about 99 meters above Lake Ontario. That is the entire drop from one lake surface to the other. And the Niagara River covers it in roughly 58 kilometers. Half of that drop happens at the falls themselves, in one step. The rest is spread along the river in a way that hides what it is doing. Because here is the part people get wrong when they look at a map. The upper river, the stretch above the falls, is not a chute. It is a broad, slow, almost lazy sheet of water. It splits around Grand Island into 2 channels and rejoins. It carries buoys. It carries pleasure boats and fishing boats and, on a summer weekend, kids on inflatable rings. In the last few kilometers before the drop, it widens into what the engineers and the international boards call the Chippewa Grass Island Pool. And the word pool is not a euphemism. It behaves like a pool. The surface is glassy in the morning. The banks are landscaped. There are benches, parking lots, a restaurant, a marina, a hydro plant, a city on each side, and street lights that come on at dusk over water that will kill you. That is the trap, and it is worth being blunt about it. The calm is the hazard. Not despite being calm, because of it. A fast, loud, obviously violent river warns everybody who approaches it. A wide, slow pool advertises the opposite. It reads as recreational. It reads as forgiving. And it stays that way for kilometers, right up until the moment the riverbed changes shape underneath it, and then the same volume of water that was moving at walking pace has to fit through a smaller space with a steeper floor. And it does what physics requires it to do. It accelerates. The gradient in the upper river is gentle enough to be invisible. About a foot of fall in every mile through most of the pool, 1/3 of a meter, which is nothing you can see, nothing you can feel, nothing that shows on the surface as anything but a faint drift. Then, at the head of the Cascade Rapids, the floor tilts. In the last stretch before the crest, the bed drops on the order of 15 meters. Same river, same volume. Steeper floor, shallower channel, and the water goes from a drift to something in the range of 40 kilometers an hour. Translate that number, because a number by itself is decoration. A strong swimmer sprinting flat out manages something in the region of 7 kilometers an hour and cannot hold it for long. This water moves at 5 or 6 times that, indefinitely. It is faster than most people can run over broken ground. It is faster than a rowboat under oars, faster than a canoe under paddles, faster than anyone can wade. It means that from the moment you realize you are in the wrong place, the brink is not minutes away. In the Cascades, the last kilometer takes about 1.5 minutes. A person who understands at that moment exactly what is happening, who makes every correct decision immediately, who is strong and calm and lucky, still runs out of river. And it is not only speed. The water in the Cascades is not water you can swim in even at 0 velocity, and that distinction matters more than the current does. The bed there is dolostone, a hard gray rock, and it is shallow and irregular. Water running fast over irregular shallow rock does not flow smoothly. It throws standing waves, waves that stay in one place while the water passes through them, and it entrains enormous quantities of air. Aerated water is less dense than water. Less dense water gives less buoyancy. A person wearing an ordinary life jacket floating perfectly well in a lake floats considerably lower in the white water above the falls, and in the worst of it, does not reliably float at all. The life jacket has not failed. The medium has changed. So the picture is this. A person in the water there is being carried at highway speed through a field of rock, breathing in bursts between waves, in a fluid that no longer holds them up properly, unable to stand because the current knocks their legs out, unable to swim across because the channel is hundreds of meters wide, and unable to reach the bank because of what the banks are. Look at the banks, because that is the piece that closes the box. Along most of the upper rapids, on both the Canadian and American sides, the edge of the river is either a constructed wall or an armored slope, or it is more rapids running over ledges into more rapids. There is no gentle shelving beach in the last kilometer. There is no eddy behind a point where a person could catch their breath. There are islands, Goat Island most famously, but the water around them is the same water. Reaching an island is not escape, it is a pause with a view. And all of this is happening at a volume most people never bother to convert into anything they can picture. During the daylight hours of the tourist season, the flow going over the crest is held at a minimum of about 2,800 cubic meters every second. An Olympic swimming pool holds roughly 2,500 cubic meters. So the falls are pushing something more than a full Olympic pool over the edge every second, all day, every day. And that is the reduced, regulated, deliberately limited version of the river, with a large share of the natural flow already taken away upstream for electricity. Now shrink the scale from the map to a single body, because this is where the numbers stop being impressive and start being personal. Stand on the deck of a small boat in the Chippewa Grass Island Pool on a July afternoon. The surface is textured, but not rough. There is a low sound in the air that you register as background. The banks look close. The color of the water gives no information at all about its speed, because water does not display velocity. It displays surface disturbance, and a deep, wide, fast body of water can be smoother than a shallow creek. There is no line painted on it. There is no change of color where the floor tilts. The last visual cue you get before the transition is a horizon, a place downstream where the surface appears to end and the sky begins. And by the time that horizon is a distinct feature rather than a distant haze, the water under the hull has already begun to accelerate. Two cues then, a horizon line and a rising noise. That is the entire warning system this river issues. And the people it fails to warn are not usually strangers. Something on the order of 12 million visitors come to Niagara Falls in a normal year, and the overwhelming majority of them never go near the water. The people who get into trouble in the upper river are, again and again, the ones with a legitimate reason to be on it. Workers, boaters, anglers, residents. And they get into trouble not because they misread a danger sign, but because the transition from safe water to unrecoverable water happens over a distance shorter than the time it takes to diagnose that anything is wrong. And then there is the consequence that runs through the next 100 years of this story, the one that explains everything that follows. Nobody can come and get you. Not because rescuers are slow or badly organized or unwilling, because the water itself is closed to them. Every rescue technique that involves a person or a boat entering the current and going to the victim is unavailable. A rescue swimmer in that water becomes a second victim, moving at the same speed toward the same edge. A boat under power in that water is a boat that will not come back upstream. Whatever help arrives has to come from above, or from the bank, or from downstream after the drop, and every one of those options is worse than the one you would want. Hold that thought, because on a day in 1918, 300 meters of open river between two men and every trained rescuer in two countries was, functionally, 300 meters of vacuum. But before that barge, there were people here who had already solved this problem. And their solution is the one detail most tellings leave out. For centuries before European boats appeared on the upper river, The water route between the lower and upper Great Lakes was not a water route at all at this point. It could not be. Anyone traveling with cargo between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie left the river entirely and carried everything overland around the gorge, a route long known and used by the indigenous nations of the region, including the Neutral and later the Haudenosaunee, and later still adopted wholesale by French and then British traders who arrived with better boats and no better options. The route had a name in the colonial documents that is almost comically plain: the carrying place. You carried. That was the technology. Think about what that represents as knowledge, because it is easy to be condescending about it and completely wrong to be. A portage route is a piece of accumulated observation. It encodes where the water stops being usable, which is a judgment about current and rock and season, made over generations, and it encodes it with an enormous safety margin. The portage did not begin at the head of the rapids where the danger becomes obvious. It began well upstream and well downstream of the dangerous water, on the reasoning that the margin for error near this river is not something you want to test. That is not superstition. That is engineering practice with a longer data set than any of the institutions that came later. And the difference between that approach and everything that came afterward can be stated in one line. The people who adapted to the river treated the water as a boundary and moved around it. The people who came later treated the river as a schedule problem and moved through it. The schedule came in with industry, and industry came here for the obvious reason. A river carrying that much water down that much drop is, in energy terms, one of the most concentrated resources on the continent, and it never stops. It does not care about drought the way a small river does, because its reservoir is a chain of inland seas. By the middle of the 19th century, there were mills on both banks feeding on it through canals and races. By the early 1880s, the first hydroelectric generation was running at Niagara. The Edward Dean Adams Station came online in 1895, and in 1896 it sent alternating current the 20-odd miles to Buffalo, settling an argument about how electricity would be distributed for the entire following century. By the 1900s, there were large generating stations standing directly on the riverbank above and below the falls, with their intakes drinking out of the upper river. Every one of those intakes needed the channel in front of it kept clear. Silt moves, gravel moves, ice moves. And so the upper river, the same water that had been treated for centuries as a thing to walk around, acquired a permanent working population, men on boats and barges, employed to maintain the water supply of the power plants, operating routinely, day after day, inside the last few kilometers above one of the highest volume waterfalls on the continent. Nobody was being reckless. It was a job. It had rules. It had equipment. It had tugs with real horsepower. And for years, it worked. On the afternoon of 6 August 1918, it stopped working. The vessel was a dumping scow, and the word scow is doing a lot of work there, so be precise about it. This was not a boat in the way most people picture a boat. It was a rectangular steel hopper about 80 feet long, flat-bottomed, with no engine, no rudder, no steering position, and no capacity whatsoever to move itself. Its entire purpose was to be filled with dredged sand and gravel, towed to a dumping point, and emptied through doors in its own floor. Under tow, it was cargo. Cut loose from the tug, it was a floating box in a current, and boxes do not choose their course. Two men were aboard: Gustav Lofberg, an experienced sailor in his early 50s, and James Harris, of a similar age, both working out of Buffalo. Their job that day was ordinary maintenance of the kind that keeps a hydroelectric river working. The intakes that fed the generating stations needed the channel in front of them, kept clear of accumulated material. And clearing it meant dredging, and dredging meant scows. The tug Hasayampa had the scow under tow upstream of the falls, well inside the calm water. On paper, control was total. There was a powered vessel with a crew, a line, a barge, a defined route, and a job that had been done many times before. Then, the scow came adrift. Accounts of exactly how differ in the detail, whether the tow line parted, whether the scow grounded first, and the strain broke the connection. And the honest position is that the mechanism of separation is not something a script should pretend to know precisely. What is not in dispute is the result. Somewhere around 2.5 kilometers above the horseshoe, a steel box weighing hundreds of tons, with 2 men standing on it, became free in the Chippewa Grass Island pool. And the pool did what the pool does. It carried them quietly, at first slowly, toward the head of the Cascades. This is the moment the whole story turns on, and it is not a moment of panic. It is a moment of arithmetic. The men could not steer. They could not swim, not in any direction that helped, because the bank was already too far and getting further downstream faster than they could cross the flow. They could not signal anyone who could do anything, because everyone on shore could already see them. They had no engine to fight the current with, and the tug that did have an engine could not come after them into shoaling water above the rapids without joining them. Every option that involved going somewhere had already closed. What Lofberg and Harris did instead was the single most intelligent thing anybody did that day, and it worked because it inverted the problem. They stopped trying to move and started trying to stop. The scow's floor was made of dumping doors. Open those doors and the compartments flood. And a flooded compartment does 2 things. It makes the vessel heavier, and it makes it sit deeper. A box that sits deeper reaches further down toward the bottom. And the bottom of the upper river in that area is a shelf of hard rock with ridges and shoals in it. They did not sink the scow to sink it. They sank it to make it long enough, vertically, to catch something. 2 men, on a runaway barge, deliberately scuttling their own vessel to make the river snag it. Nobody there was waiting to be saved. Those were 2 men reading the physics correctly with minutes to work in. It caught. The scow grounded on a shoal roughly 600 to 800 meters above the brink of the Horseshoe Falls. And there it stopped. And there it stayed. And the men were still standing on it. Reports at the time put the distance at about 2,500 feet from the falls. Close enough to hear it. Close enough to see the mist rising off the drop from where they stood. On a steel deck. In a river moving past them fast enough to take a standing person off their feet. And then they prepared for the shoal to let go, which tells you exactly how much confidence they had in it. Lofberg tied himself to the scow, on the reasoning that if it went over, he would go with it rather than be washed off ahead of it. Harris tied himself to a barrel, on the opposite reasoning, that he might be carried clear and catch a rock. 2 men on the same deck, betting on 2 incompatible outcomes, because neither of them knew which one the river would hand them. They had solved the immediate problem completely. They had also created the problem that took the next day to fail to solve, because grounded is not rescued. Grounded means stationary in a place nobody can reach, on a structure that was never intended to hold against sustained current, held there by nothing more reliable than friction between steel and rock. Every hour, the water worked at it. If the scow shifted, if it rotated, if it lifted on the floe and slid off the shoal, the remaining distance would be covered in something under a minute, and there was no version of that ending which involved either man surviving. So the clock started, and the response was immediate, competent, well-equipped for its era, and almost entirely useless. Tugs tried first. That is the natural instinct. The scow came off a tow, so put it back on a tow. Working a powered vessel up into the current toward the head of the rapids is not impossible in itself, but every meter closer means shallower water, faster flow, and less margin for a mechanical failure. Get a line to the scow, and you now have a tug attached by cable to a grounded object in a river trying to pull both downstream. Break loose from the shoal, And you may find you have converted a stuck barge into a moving barge tethered to a boat that cannot outrun it. The attempts failed against the current, and the decision not to keep pushing them was correct, rather than timid, which left the geometry that has defined every serious rescue attempt in this river since. If you cannot go across the water, and you cannot go up the water, you go over it. The equipment that made that possible came from the United States Coast Guard station downriver at Youngstown, near the lake, and it was old technology even in 1918, a Lyle gun, a stubby line-throwing cannon developed for shipwrecks close to shore. It fires a projectile trailing a light line. You get the light line to the wreck. The people on the wreck haul it in, and attached to the far end of the light line is a heavier one, and attached to that is a hawser strong enough to carry a person. Rig the hawser tight between the wreck and a fixed point ashore. Hang a ring buoy with canvas leg holes from it on a pulley, a breeches buoy, and you can haul a human being over water without ever entering it. The problem in Niagara was elevation and distance. To have any chance of stretching a line above 300 meters of open river, the shore end has to be high. So the gun crew went up onto the roof of the Toronto Power Generating Station on the Canadian Bank, the great stone powerhouse standing at the edge of the upper river, and fired from there, out over the rapids, at a target the size of a rail car. Before any of that could happen, the equipment had to arrive. And this is the part of 1918 that people skip and should not. The gun and the line gear were not sitting in a shed beside the falls. The nearest station with that capability was down at the mouth of the river, close to 20 kilometers away on the American side, and the whole outfit — gun, powder charges, projectiles, coiled lines. The crew who knew how to use them had to be loaded, moved by road along the gorge, and set up on the opposite bank in another country. That is ours, on 1918 roads, with 1918 vehicles, while two men stand on a barge held by friction. Then came the arithmetic of the shot itself, which is unforgiving. A line-throwing gun of that period has a useful range in the low hundreds of meters, and the range is degraded by everything present that day. The weight of the line it drags, the wind funneling along the river, and the fact that the target is not a beach, but a specific steel box 300 meters out with a current between. Every miss meant hauling several hundred meters of wet line back in by hand, reflaking it so it would run without snagging, reloading, and firing again while the light went. And the light did go. This is the detail that turns the incident from a difficult afternoon into something much worse. It got dark. The rescue ran through the night. They put searchlights on the scow from the shore, which meant the men out there spent the hours of darkness illuminated, visible, the object of attention of thousands of people on two riverbanks, standing on a deck with nothing to do and nowhere to sit down, and no way to know whether the shoal beneath them would still be holding at dawn. They had no food, no shelter, and no dry clothing. August nights on that river are cold when you are wet and standing still in wind, coming off moving water. Shots missed, shots fell short, shots landed, and the line parted, or the current took it. The crowd on the banks grew through the afternoon into the thousands, on both sides of an international border, watching two men stand on a steel deck and wave. Eventually, a line reached the scow, and the men hauled across the heavier rope, and by evening, there was a hawser rigged between the powerhouse roof and the barge, and the breeches buoy went out. And then the ropes tangled. This is the detail that makes the 1918 story more than an adventure anecdote, and it is worth slowing down for. A breeches buoy rig is not one rope. It is a hawser to ride on, plus a continuous loop of lighter line running through blocks at both ends so that people on shore can haul the buoy out and haul it back. Those lines have to run clean. 300 meters of rope sagging into wind over a rapids, with a heavy pulley and a buoy on it, snarled around itself somewhere out in the middle of the river, in the dark, in the noise. The riggers on the roof could feel that it was fouled. They could not see how, and nothing they did from the shore end cleared it. Everything now depended on somebody being able to see the tangle up close. At around 3 in the morning, a local riverman named William Hill, known universally as Red Hill, went out on the lines. Hill was not a Coast Guard officer or an engineer. He occupied a category that barely exists anymore and that every river town used to have: the man you send for. He had spent his working life on this river and in the gorge below it, pulling people out of the water when it was possible and recovering the dead when it was not. And over the course of that life, he was credited with a long list of both. Local authorities called him because the alternative was calling nobody. He was not on any payroll for what he did that night. He rode out over the rapids in the dark, on ropes. Above water, he understood better than anyone present and worked on the snarl. Picture the working conditions. He is suspended from a cable that sags between a rooftop and a grounded barge, over rapids. At 3 in the morning, in searchlight beams that reflect off spray and blind more than they illuminate. The noise below is loud enough to make shouting useless at any distance. His hands are wet. Everything he touches is wet rope under tension, and rope under tension is the thing that takes fingers. There is no harness system in the modern sense, no backup line, no team ready to extract him. If he falls, there is no rescue for the rescuer, and everyone on that roof knows it. He cleared enough to make it possible to try again. It was not enough to finish it. At about 8:30 in the morning, he went out a second time, and this time he got to within roughly 130 feet of the scow, close enough over the noise of the rapids to shout instructions to Lofberg and Harris about which ropes to pull, in which order, to free the fouled block from their end. That is the actual mechanism of this rescue, and it is almost absurd in its simplicity. After a night of gunfire and cable and institutional effort, the thing that finally worked was 2 exhausted men on a barge, doing exactly what a third man suspended over a rapids told them to do with their hands. The lines came clear. The breech's buoy ran. They took the men off one at a time, hauled slowly over the water that had been trying to kill them since the previous afternoon, and set them down on the roof of the powerhouse they had been staring at all night. Lofberg came off last, at 10 in the morning. How long they were out there is disputed in the detail. Most accounts put it between 17 and 19 hours. Some considerably longer, depending on when the clock is started and which newspaper's timeline is followed. The disagreement is not important to the meaning, and it is more honest to leave it standing than to pick the most dramatic number. Hill was decorated for it. He had come home from the war in Europe not long before, and he would spend the rest of his life doing versions of the same job. What matters is the shape of it. For that entire period, in a place with a city, a police force, a Coast Guard station, industrial infrastructure, and thousands of witnesses on both banks, the total available intervention was a rope fired through the air by a man standing on a roof, and the wreck did not go anywhere. That is the part that should sit uncomfortably. The scow stayed on that shoal after the men were taken off. It stayed through the winter. It stayed through the next winter, and the one after that, and it kept staying, rusting thinner every year, visible from the tourist path, photographed by millions of people who mostly assumed it was some sort of installation. It was still there in the 1950s. It was still there in the 1990s. It was still there 101 years later. And nobody removed it, which people assume must be negligence, and is not. Consider what removing it would have required. The scow sits in the middle of the upper rapids. There is no way to bring a vessel alongside it, because the water that stopped every tug in 1918 has not changed. There is no way to put a crew on it safely for the length of time that cutting or rigging would take. Any attempt to pull it off the shoal risks doing exactly what the men aboard spent that afternoon preventing: floating it. At which point several hundred tons of steel goes over the crest of the horseshoe with whatever cable is attached to it. The only serious option would be an air operation of some scale. To lift or cut something that is not lifting rated is full of holes, and is sitting in a place where a dropped load cannot be recovered. So it stayed and became a fixture, and a generation of guides pointed at it, and it turned into the strangest kind of monument, an accident that nobody was able to clean up, still occupying the scene of its own emergency. Think about what that means about the river rather than about the barge. A current strong enough to be unreachable by any vessel, any swimmer, and any rescue service in two countries was not strong enough to move a grounded steel hull off a rock in a century. The Upper Niagara is not simply a fast river. It is a river that holds what it cannot release, and it will hold it in the one place where nobody can go and get it. That is the first hard rule of this place. Help arrives from above or it does not arrive. What this river taught next took another few decades, and it came from an entirely unexpected direction, from the people who set out to bring it under control and largely succeeded. Because by the middle of the 20th century, the answer to the Niagara problem was not going to be better ropes. It was going to be taking the river's flow away from it. The logic was simple and in its own terms, unanswerable. Water going over the falls does no work. Water sent through a tunnel to a turbine and does an enormous amount of work. Every cubic meter that drops down the cataract for the benefit of photographers is a cubic meter not producing electricity for two industrial regions. The engineering question of the 20th century at Niagara was not whether to divert the river, it was how much, and who got it, and when. That question was settled by treaty. In 1950, Canada and the United States signed an agreement that did something almost nobody outside the region realizes. It put the flow of Niagara Falls on a timetable. The treaty set a floor, not a level. During daylight hours of the tourist season, no less than 100,000 cubic feet per second, about 2,830 cubic meters a second, must go over the crest. At all other times, at night and through the winter, the minimum is half that. Everything above the minimum can be taken for power, split evenly between the two countries. Read that again, because the implication is bigger than it first appears. The falls you photograph in the afternoon and the falls that run at 3 in the morning in February are not the same waterfall. Half the water can be somewhere else, moving through tunnels bored under the cities on both sides, dropping through turbines several kilometers downstream, rejoining the river below the gorge, as though nothing had happened. The show has opening hours. Making that work required a structure in the river itself, and it is standing there today in plain sight of every visitor who has never once wondered what it is. Roughly 800 meters above the horseshoe, a low concrete arm reaches out from the Canadian bank and runs about halfway across the upper river to an artificial island, pierced by 18 sluice gates. That is the international control structure. Its gates open and close to hold the Chippewa Grass Island pool at the level the operators want, and to steer water toward or away from the intakes feeding the generating stations. It is not a dam across the river. It cannot be, because the river cannot be stopped. It is a set of taps on one side of a channel that is still, at all times, delivering the drainage of most of a continent's inland seas. The result is a piece of controlled landscape that almost nobody perceives as controlled. That glassy morning surface in the pool is glassy partly because its level is being managed to within centimeters. The rapids are consistent from week to week because the supply into them is regulated. Tour operators, boat crews, fishermen, and park staff all work against a river that is, in the ordinary sense of the word, reliable. And reliability is exactly what makes people relax. There is an old habit of thinking about control structures as pure risk reduction. And at Niagara, that habit is only half right. Consider what regulating the pool actually achieved for the people who use the upper river. Steadier levels mean the marina works predictably. The launch ramps work predictably. The shoreline is stable. The water in front of the town looks the same every time you look at it. Steadier levels also mean the boundary between the harmless pool and the water that kills you sits in almost the same place every day, which sounds like a safety improvement and functions for anybody who does not already know the river as a disguise. Nothing about a regulated surface tells you where the floor tilts. The engineers were, at least, honest about what they were doing. The purpose of the treaty and the control works was never public safety in the upper rapids. It was the preservation of the scenic value of the falls and the distribution of an energy resource. Safety in the pool was somebody else's file. There is a practical consequence of that timetable which almost nobody outside the operating agencies thinks about, and it is a hazard in its own right. The river you look at before the gates change is not the river you will be looking at 2 hours later. Overnight and out of season, a large fraction of the flow is going through the tunnels to the turbines, and the water in the upper river runs correspondingly lower. Rocks are exposed that will not be exposed later. Shoals stand clear. The margin along the bank is wider and looks stable. Then the schedule turns over, the gate settings change, more water is sent to the crest, and the level in the pool and the rapids comes up, not as a flood, not as a wave, just as a steady, silent rise in a river with no rain falling on it and no wind pushing it. For anyone standing on a rock that was dry when they walked out to it, that is a rising tide with no visible cause. For anyone who has beached a small boat on gravel that is about to be underwater, it is a boat that leaves without them. It is one of the few genuinely artificial hazards in this river, and it is entirely predictable, and it catches people because human beings assume that a river's level is a fact about the day, rather than a decision made by an operator against a clock. There is one more thing the diversion did, and it is genuinely remarkable. It slowed the destruction of the falls themselves. To see why, you have to understand what the falls physically are. The cap is a layer of hard dolostone, a tough gray rock that resists erosion well. Underneath it are softer layers, shale in particular, which do not. Falling water and the churn at the base attack the soft rock beneath the hard rock, hollowing out the face, until the unsupported dolostone slab above finally has nothing left holding it and breaks off. The falls do not wear down, they step backwards. Over roughly 12,000 years, the drop has walked about 11 kilometers upstream from the escarpment at Lewiston, carving the gorge behind it as it went. The gorge is not a valley the river found. It is a record of where the waterfall used to be. Historic rates of retreat were on the order of a meter a year in places, sometimes more. Take half the water away for half of every day, and you take away a large fraction of the energy doing the undercutting. And you also spread the remaining flow more evenly across the crest instead of concentrating it in the deep center notch. The retreat slowed dramatically. In the crude accounting of the 20th century, this was a triumph. The falls were saved by being partly turned off. If you want proof of how completely the engineering answer had won by the 1960s, take the summer of 1969, when the United States Army Corps of Engineers turned the American Falls off entirely. Not metaphorically. Starting on 9 June 1969, contractors dumped more than 28,000 tons of rock into a live river to build a cofferdam some 600 feet across the channel between the mainland and Goat Island, and diverted the whole American Channel over to the Canadian side. The American Falls stopped. For about 5 months, the second largest of the 3 cataracts here was a dry cliff with a wet stain on it, and engineers walked around on the exposed bed with clipboards, studying the enormous pile of collapsed rock at the base and deciding whether to remove it. Crowds came to see nothing happen. People stood at the railings and looked down at a stone floor that had been under white water their entire lives, at drill holes, at rubbish, at coins thrown by tourists over decades and now simply lying there. The Corps studied the talus, calculated the cost of hauling it out to make the fall look more like a postcard, and eventually concluded that removing it would only accelerate the erosion the rock pile was buttressing. On 26 November, they took the cofferdam out and let the water back. That is what confidence looked like at Niagara in the 20th century. a river with the drainage of 4 Great Lakes behind it. And the institutional response was, "Hold on, we'll switch this one off while we have a look." It is worth holding that confidence up against what the rock had done to the same institutions in the years immediately before. On the morning of 28 July 1954, a park employee noticed a crack in the pavement of the Prospect Point viewing area at the American Falls. At 10 to 5 that afternoon, a wedge of stone estimated at something like 185,000 tons broke away there and dropped into the gorge. That is the caprock mechanism operating on schedule. Soft rock undercut, hard rock unsupported, hard rock leaves. And the warning that day was a crack in a footpath, seen hours ahead, on a viewing platform that generations of visitors had stood on. It also added to the pile of boulders at the base of the American Falls, which is the pile the Corps would be studying 15 years later, and which is the reason that particular cataract does not have deep water underneath it. 2 years after that, the rock came for the industry directly. The Schulkopf power station was built into the gorge wall on the American side below the falls. A long stone and steel plant standing at river level, with the cliff rising immediately behind it. Fed by water brought from above through conduits. It was the largest generating station on the American side, and it had been running for decades. At 25 past 10 on the morning of 7th June 1956, workers found water seeping through the rock at the back of the plant. Construction crews were called in to find the leak and repair it. It got worse through the day. Guards started turning visitors away at the gate, telling them the site was closed because of a serious leak. Shortly after 5 in the afternoon, nearly 7 hours after that first trickle was reported, the gorge wall behind the station gave way, and 2/3 of the plant went into the river. Around 40 men were inside. One was killed, Richard Draper, 39. A maintenance foreman with 12 years in the building, thrown through a window by a burst penstock. His body was not recovered for 2 months. 5 others went to hospital. Given what the collapse did to the structure, the fact that the toll was 1 is the direct result of somebody treating a seep in a wall as an emergency and clearing the building. The plant was not rebuilt. The loss of that much generating capacity forced a political and engineering response on a scale that dwarfed the station itself, and the answer was the Niagara Power Project. A new plant sited well downstream at Lewiston, drawing water from intakes above the falls and carrying it through enormous conduits beneath the city. It opened in January 1961, 3 years after it was started, as the largest hydroelectric facility in the Western world. Look at the logic of that response, because it is the same logic as the Rainbow Bridge, and it repeats through this whole story. The failure was at the gorge wall, so the new plant was built away from the gorge wall. The problem was proximity to a face of rock that is being actively undercut by the river, so the solution was distance from that specific face. Correct, effective, and entirely local. Nobody proposed to stop the undercutting because nobody can. So here's the question that ought to be nagging by now. If the flow can be scheduled, the level regulated, the erosion slowed, and an entire cataract shut down for a study, in what sense is this river still dangerous in any way that matters? The answer is the reversal that everything after this depends on. And it is not subtle once you see it. Every one of those controls governs what leaves the pool. Not one of them governs what arrives. The gates decide how much water goes over the crest and how much goes to the turbines. They do not decide how much water comes down the river in the first place. That is determined 30 kilometers upstream at the eastern end of Lake Erie, by a lake that has no gates at all. And Lake Erie is, in the specific sense that matters here, the most unstable of the Great Lakes. It is by far the shallowest, with a mean depth of only about 19 meters, and it is long, roughly 380 kilometers, and it lies with its long axis pointing southwest to northeast. Southwest to northeast is also the direction the strongest winds in that region tend to come from. A long, shallow body of water aligned with the prevailing wind is a bathtub with a person sitting at one end. Push hard enough for long enough on the surface, and the water physically piles up at the downwind end and drains away from the upwind end. This is a seiche, and on Erie, it is not a laboratory curiosity. Differences of several meters between the water level at Toledo, at the western end, and Buffalo, at the eastern end, have been recorded. In a strong southwest gale, the level at Buffalo, which is to say at the doorway of the Niagara River, can rise by more than a meter in a matter of hours, while the far end of the lake drops by a comparable amount. The Niagara River begins at Buffalo. Whatever the wind decides to do with the eastern end of Lake Erie is delivered directly into the river's mouth, at speed, with whatever the lake happens to be carrying on its surface at the time. That last clause is the one that matters most, and it is the hinge of this entire story. Water is not the only thing that gets pushed to the eastern end of Lake Erie. For roughly 4 months of the year, the surface of that lake carries ice, not a smooth sheet, broken flows, wind-driven, ranging from slush to slabs the size of buildings, constantly rearranged by exactly the same winds that produce the seiche. Piling water at the eastern end means piling ice at the eastern end, and the eastern end has one exit, about a kilometer wide at the head of the river, and behind that exit is a narrowing channel, a set of rapids, a chain of bridges, a waterfall, a gorge, and the industrial infrastructure of 2 countries, which means the honest description of the Niagara River is not that it is a fast river with a waterfall in it. It is that it is the drain of a shallow, wind-driven lake, and the wind decides what goes down the drain. The first time that was demonstrated at full scale, nobody had built a single control gate, and the river did something no engineer has managed since. It stopped. On the night of 29th of March 1848, the people of the villages on both sides of the falls went to sleep in the ordinary noise of the place. The sound of Niagara is not an occasional feature of living there. It is the background of everything. A low, continuous pressure in the air that residents stop consciously hearing within weeks of moving in, the way people stop hearing a motorway. Sometime after midnight, it went quiet. Everyone who was there told it the same way, and there is no reason to doubt them, because it is precisely the detail a population would notice. People did not wake up because of a noise. They woke up because of the absence of one. Men went outside in the dark to find out what had happened to the river, and by morning what they found was a riverbed. The falls had effectively stopped. Not entirely, not everywhere, but reduced to trickles and dribbles, running down a rock face that had never in living memory been anything other than white. The American Falls was close to dry. The horseshoe was a fraction of itself. In the gorge below, boulders that had been under the churn since before European contact stood in air. Upstream, the rapids were a field of wet stone with pools in it. The cause was 30 kilometers away and made entirely of wind and ice. Lake Erie had been frozen through the winter, and by late March, that ice was breaking into a floating mass, which is what it does every spring. Strong winds moved that mass down the lake toward its eastern end, and at the head of the Niagara River, a comparatively narrow, shallow exit at Buffalo, the flows arrived faster than they could pass through. They grounded on the shallows and jammed against each other. Each new arrival wedged the pile tighter. Within hours, there was a dam across the entrance to the river, built by the lake out of its own frozen surface, holding back the outflow of an inland sea. The river below did what any river does when the tap is closed. It drained. The water already in the channel kept going over the falls because gravity does not pause. And behind it came almost nothing, and the Niagara ran itself empty from the top down. Everything about the human response to that morning is worth looking at honestly, because it explains a pattern that repeats through this entire story. Some people were frightened in a serious, structured way. Church attendance in the villages jumped. There were sermons on judgment, In 1848, in a river town, an event with no available natural explanation and no precedent in anyone's memory produced exactly the response you would expect. And it is not a reason to look down on them. They had no meteorological network, no telegraphic report from Buffalo, no theory of a wind-driven ice jam. They had a river that had run for as long as anyone knew, and then did not. Others treated it as an opportunity, and here is where the pattern shows. People walked out onto the exposed bed of the Niagara River in their thousands. They picked up artifacts that had been lying in the water since the War of 1812. Bayonets, gun barrels, tools, all the metal debris of a militarized border 35 years earlier, and carried them home as souvenirs. Accounts describe a squadron of cavalry from the American side riding along the dry riverbed for the sheer novelty of it. Sightseers walked out toward the brink of the falls themselves and looked down. And the ferry and steamboat men, who were practical above all, saw a business problem solved. Boat operators working the lower river had for years been obstructed by rocks in the channel near the crossing. With the water gone, then crews went out onto the bed with explosives and blasted the obstructions away. Reports from the period credit the mate of the missed operation with taking exactly this opportunity to improve its navigation. It is a wonderfully human detail. The river disappears in an act of nature nobody understands, and within a day somebody is out there with black powder doing maintenance. Nobody, so far as the record shows, was killed, which is close to astonishing because of what was actually happening upstream while all this was going on. The ice dam at Buffalo was not a structure. It was a jam. And a jam is an unstable arrangement of loose objects held in place by friction and pressure. It could release at any moment, in any weather, without warning. And when it did release, it would not do so politely. The lake behind it had been rising against it for a day and a half. Every hour of blockage stored more head, and the head is energy waiting to be spent. There were people standing in the bed of that river with an unmonitored, unmeasured, unstable mass of ice upstream. A mass that no one had inspected, that no one could inspect, that no institution on Earth was watching, holding back the accumulated outflow of Lake Erie. Nobody was going to shout a warning, because there was nobody positioned to see it happen, and no means of transmitting the message faster than the water. The stoppage is usually put at about 30 hours. What broke it was the same variable that had caused it. On 31st March, the temperature climbed into the 60s and the wind changed direction, and the jam at the head of the river lost its grip. By the evening of the 31st, the river was full again. The accounts describe the return as a rising roar and then a wall of water coming down the river with a front of ice in it, restoring in minutes what had taken a day and a half to disappear. The falls came back. The mills got their water. The sightseers, by good fortune more than judgment, were off the bed. Now, the standard way to tell that story is as a curiosity. The day Niagara Falls turned off. Told that way, it is trivia, and trivia is useless. Told correctly, it is the single most important piece of evidence about what this place actually is, because it proves that the volume of the Niagara River is not a property of the river. It is a mood of a lake, delivered from 30 kilometers upwind, and the delivery mechanism is weather that can change in a few hours. And it is worth being precise about why Erie behaves this way, when the other Great Lakes largely do not, because the difference is the reason this particular river has this particular problem. Lake Superior is enormous and deep, hundreds of meters deep across most of its area. Wind pushing on the surface of a deep lake moves a thin skin of water on top of a very large volume that stays where it is, and the effect on the level at either end is comparatively small. Erie is the opposite case in almost every respect. It is the shallowest of the five by a wide margin, with a mean depth of only around 19 meters, and it is long and narrow and lies with its axis pointing into the direction the strongest winds come from. When wind pushes on that, there is not much water underneath to absorb the shove. the whole body responds. And once it has been tilted, it does not simply return. The water sloshes. A seiche oscillates. Piled up at one end, it runs back toward the other, overshoots, and comes back again, with a natural period measured in hours, so that a single strong wind event can produce a series of level swings over the following day or more, long after the wind that caused it has died. Anyone reading a gauge at the eastern end during that period is reading 1 point on a curve that is still moving. The supply side of the Niagara River, then. Not a reservoir, an oscillating one. Everything downstream inherits that. Every intake, every generating station, every bridge pier, every boat, every rescue plan, every person standing on a bank. The river they are dealing with is whatever Lake Erie sent them this morning. And if wind can subtract water, then wind can also add it. And wind can deliver the ice itself instead of holding it back. Not as a dam 30 kilometers away, but into the river, at speed, in bulk. This is the mechanism that runs through the next century of this story, and it needs to be understood physically rather than as a word, because most people hear ice on a river and imagine a smooth, white lid. River ice at Niagara comes in several forms, and the dangerous ones are not the lid. Lake ice arrives as flows, slabs, sometimes many meters across and a meter or more thick, driven into the river mouth by wind and carried downstream by a current that is already among the fastest of any comparable river on the continent. A cubic meter of ice weighs a bit under a ton. A flow 30 meters across is a moving object weighing hundreds of tons, unpowered, unsteerable, indifferent. Then there is frazzle, which almost nobody outside cold regions engineering has heard of and which causes more industrial grief here than the flows do. In turbulent, fast-moving water in freezing conditions, the water cannot form a surface sheet because the surface will not stay still. Instead, it supercools slightly and grows ice crystals throughout the flow. A suspension of frazzle, essentially slush, distributed through the whole column. That slush is buoyant and sticky. It accumulates against anything it meets, and what it meets in the Niagara are the trash racks and intake screens of the power stations. A plant can be running normally and then find its intakes progressively blinded by a substance that is not visible from the surface and cannot be shoveled off. And then there is what happens where the water slows. Slush and broken ice moving downstream into slower reaches collect underneath the surface ice, forming what engineers call hanging dams, accumulations that grow downward from the underside of the ice cover and can occupy a large fraction of the channel's depth. From a helicopter, nothing. Underneath, the river's cross-section is being throttled by ice you cannot see, which raises levels upstream and can send water where water has never been. Now put that together with the geography of this specific river. At the falls, that entire load, flows, slush, broken cover, goes over the edge with the water, drops 50 meters, and lands in the plunge pool at the bottom of a gorge, less than 400 meters wide. In a hard winter, so much of it arrives that the gorge fills. The blocks pile against each other and freeze together and build a mass of ice spanning bank to bank, tens of meters thick, extending downstream for hundreds of meters. The locals called it the Ice Bridge, and for decades they treated it as one of the finest attractions in the region. They walked out on it. That is not an exaggeration or a rare stunt. Hundreds of people at a time crossed the Niagara Gorge on foot, on the ice, in winter, in ordinary clothes. There were shanties built on it, selling drinks and souvenirs and photographs. Families went out. Children went out. People crossed an international border on it, informally, in both directions, over a mass of frozen debris resting on the surface of a river that had just fallen 50 meters and was still moving. For about half a century, nothing catastrophic happened, which is precisely the problem, because half a century of nothing happening is the most persuasive safety argument human beings ever encounter, and it is not evidence of anything at all. On Sunday, 4th February 1912, the ice bridge was crowded because it was a Sunday, and the weather was mild, and this was a normal thing to do. Around 35 people were out on it, walking between the gorge walls below the falls, some of them tourists, some of them locals who had been doing it since childhood. One of the locals was William Hill Sr., who had a refreshment stand out on the ice and was opening it up for the day, the same man who, 6 years later, would be crawling out on ropes above the Cascades. Shortly before noon, the ice began to move. Nobody has ever established the exact trigger, and it is not necessary to invent one. A mass of frozen blocks resting in a gorge is held in place by grounding against the walls, by friction, and by the balance between the strength of the assembly and the force of the water still running underneath it. Milder air weakens the bonds. Flow changes lift it. A single shift in the arrangement takes the load off one anchor and puts it on another. The failure of an ice bridge is not gradual. The structure holds, and then it is a raft. Most of the people on it got to shore. That is the first thing to say, because it is the reason the day is remembered as a disaster with 3 deaths rather than 30. Hill felt the ice shift under his stand, and by the accounts of that morning, he went for the Canadian shore, shouting at everyone he passed to follow him. Ice at the edges was still against the banks. There were stairs and inclined railways up the gorge on both sides, and the crowd moved. 4 did not make it off in time, and their positions were determined by where they happened to be standing when the mass let go. Eldridge Stanton, 32, and his wife Clara, 28, a couple from Toronto, were out in the middle. 2 young men from Cleveland, Ignatius Roth and Russell Boyce, were also on the moving ice. And Burrell Heacock, 17 years old, also of Cleveland, had reached ground, or close enough to it that his survival was no longer in doubt, when he saw the Stantons stranded and went back. Understand the geometry of what going back meant. The ice was already drifting downstream, into the narrows below the falls, toward the Whirlpool Rapids, which is one of the most violent stretches of navigable-looking water on the continent. A compressed channel where the entire river forces itself between gorge walls and stands up in waves several meters high. Once the raft entered that, it would break apart. Everyone involved on the banks knew that. It is why they were running. What they had to work with was the answer this river always forces, 6 years before the scow crew would need it again. You cannot go across the water. You go over it. The gorge at that point is spanned by bridges. Men ran onto the Michigan Central Cantilever Bridge downstream and onto the Great Steel Arch upstream, the Falls View Bridge, known to everyone as the Honeymoon Bridge, and they lowered ropes. Long ropes, tens of meters, dropped from a bridge deck to a moving ice raft in a river, in winter, with the target passing underneath at increasing speed. The ropes reached. That is the extraordinary part. In the middle of a chaotic emergency, with no plan and no equipment beyond what was on hand, men on a railway bridge put lines onto a specific moving flow in the Niagara Gorge. Roth and Boyce got hold of a rope and climbed it and were pulled up alive. Burrell Heacock got hold of one too. And this is where the geometry breaks, and it is worth being unsentimental about it, because it is the mechanism that recurs in this river for another century. The failure was not in the rope, the aim, the timing, or the courage of anybody on the bridge. It was in a 17-year-old's hands. He had been out on the ice in February. He had gone back for the Stantons and been on the moving raft for minutes in cold, in spray. Climbing a rope hand over hand for 50 meters with a body's full weight is difficult for a fit adult in a gymnasium. With cold, stiffened fingers, after exertion and fear, it is close to impossible, and grip failure is not a decision. He lost his hold and fell. The Stantons never got onto a rope at all. Clara had fallen and could not keep going. Some accounts have Eldridge cutting footholds in the ice with a knife to get her to a line. What the accounts agree on is how it ended. The two of them together on the floe, kneeling, holding onto each other, as it went into the whirlpool rapids. Both died. Recovery of the dead from the Niagara Gorge in winter is a slow and partial business, and it was here. 3 people, on a routine Sunday outing, at a site with 2 international bridges over it, hundreds of witnesses, and immediate willing help from above. The outcome came fast. More ice formed the very next day and mended the bridge, and the police went out and posted signs forbidding anyone to walk on it. That was the last time visitors were allowed onto the ice below Niagara Falls, and the prohibition held. It is one of the few genuinely clean regulatory responses in this whole story. A hazard identified, an activity banned, the ban enforced, the deaths stopped. Nobody has died on the Niagara Ice Bridge since, because nobody is allowed to be on it. Notice what the ban did and did not do, though. It removed people from the ice. It did nothing to the ice. And the ice was, at that moment, still a mass measured in millions of tons, arriving each winter into a gorge with hydroelectric infrastructure built into its walls and steel bridges spanning it. Infrastructure which, unlike tourists, could not be told to stay home. 26 years later, the river collected on that. The winter of 1937-38 delivered a heavy ice run into the Niagara. On 25 January, a storm pushed an enormous volume of Lake Erie ice down the river and over both cataracts, and it built 2 ice bridges in the gorge inside a day. The mass kept rising against the Canadian wall until it reached the Ontario Power Station, a generating plant built into the gorge at the base of the horseshoe. Ice piled against the walls, then came into the building, and the plant had to stop generating. The local paper reported on 26 January that the ice mountains outside had risen to within 15 feet of the top of the building. The same thing had happened to that plant in 1909, and each time it took months to bring back into service. Nobody was surprised, and nobody could do anything about it. Take that in as a physical image. A power station, a large industrial structure of stone and steel with turbine halls inside it, submerged in broken ice up to just below its roofline, by a river doing something entirely routine for it. The plant was not damaged by an unusual flood. It was buried by the ordinary product of a cold winter arriving all at once. A quarter of a mile downstream, spanning the gorge from wall to wall, stood the Honeymoon Bridge, a 2-hinged steel arch opened in 1898, the longest steel arch bridge in the world when it was finished, and the same bridge from which men had lowered ropes in 1912. Its arch sprang from abutments low in the gorge, close to the water, which was an efficient and elegant design and an exposed one. The ice ran into it. Floes driven downstream by the river piled into the gorge, and the pack rose, and the pressure went into the bridge's feet. Here is where this incident earns its place, because the people responsible did almost everything right, and it did not matter. They watched the ice. They saw the pack building against the abutments. They measured the structure and found the upper works had shifted toward the falls. One man on site put the movement at as much as 7 inches. At 9 in the morning on 26 January, they closed the bridge to traffic, which is the decision that saved every life involved and which was made in time. Then crews went to work through the night building timber cribs and reinforcements against the abutments, doing the only thing available to them, propping the one part of the structure the ice was attacking. By the morning of the 27th, the news looked good. The wind had changed and the ice had stopped growing. Engineers checked the bridge and found no further movement since noon the previous day. The reinforcing had held. The working assumption that morning was that it would survive. By the afternoon, they had reversed it and declared the bridge beyond saving. And they were right about that too. with about as much time to act on it as they had had before. Men were still clearing the site when the rivets began to snap. At about 20 past 4 on 27th January 1938, the middle of the arch buckled, and the honeymoon bridge went into the gorge in 4 pieces. It did not fall into water. It fell onto ice, and it stayed there, twisted steel lying across a frozen river, photographed from every angle by a crowd that had been waiting for it since the closure. The wreckage rested on the ice for months. Nobody was killed. Nobody was hurt. Now, the comfortable reading of that day is that the warning worked. And in the narrow sense, it did. The correct reading is harder and more useful. The warning was correct, and it was useless. Correct, because the engineers identified the threat, evaluated it properly, and cleared the deck in time. Useless, because knowing precisely what is about to happen changes nothing when the threatened object cannot move and the force cannot be reduced. There was no action available that could have taken the load off. You cannot evacuate a bridge in the sense that matters to a bridge. You cannot ask the pack to pass on the other side. Their reinforcement work was not incompetence. It was the only lever in the room, and the lever was too small. That is the second hard rule of this place, and it will hold through every modern incident that follows. Warning time and rescue capability are different things, and the river distinguishes between them ruthlessly. You will usually see it coming. What you can do about it in the time available is a separate question with its own, much worse, answer. The bridge was replaced downstream by the Rainbow Bridge, begun in the spring of 1940 and opened on the 1st of November 1941, and the design lesson was learned in the most direct possible way. The new bridge's arch springs from much higher on the gorge walls, above where the ice can reach. It is a real improvement. It also has the shape that every improvement in this story has. It protects the specific thing that failed last time. It does nothing about the mechanism. And the mechanism, in the case of a bridge, is worth spelling out because ice-damaged a bridge is one of those phrases that slides past without leaving an impression. Ice arriving in a gorge does not strike a structure once, like a vehicle hitting a pier. It accumulates against it and then pushes, continuously, for as long as the river keeps delivering more. The load is not an impact. It is a slowly increasing pressure applied by a mass that is being topped up from upstream at a rate nobody controls, in a channel with nowhere else to put it. Add the wedging effect of blocks that ride up on top of each other and freeze, and the pack becomes a solid body transmitting the push of the whole river into whatever is in its way. An arch bridge is a superb structure for carrying loads downward into its abutments. It is a poor structure for resisting a horizontal shove applied directly to those abutments from the side, which is precisely what a rising ice pack in a narrow gorge does. Move the springing points 30 meters up the wall and the pack cannot reach them. That is the whole design change, and it has worked for more than 80 years. The ice, of course, is still delivered. It simply arrives at a place where there is now nothing valuable for it to lean on, and the mechanism itself is untouched, 30 kilometers upstream, in a shallow lake, waiting for a southwest wind. The attempt to deal with it there, at the source, rather than at each thing it breaks, came after decades of ice damage to plants, intakes, and structures, and it is one of the largest and least known pieces of seasonal infrastructure on the Great Lakes, and it is installed and removed every single year like a piece of garden furniture. Every autumn, workboats go out to the eastern end of Lake Erie, to the place where the lake becomes the river, and they string a barrier across it. Steel pontoons, each several meters long, linked end to end by cable, anchored to the lake bed, running about 2,700 meters from the outer breakwall at Buffalo, almost to the Canadian shore. It has gone in every year since 1964. The original timber sections were replaced entirely with steel pontoons in the late 1990s, partly because steel floats better and is harder for ice to ride over. It goes in when the lake surface temperature drops to about 4 degrees Celsius, or by the middle of December, whichever comes first, and it comes out in spring when the ice in the eastern basin has largely gone. The public name for it is the ice boom, and the public understanding of it is wrong in a way that is worth correcting carefully, because the misunderstanding is exactly the kind that produces false confidence. People assume it is a wall that keeps ice out of the river. It is not. It cannot be. No structure that could actually block the ice at the outlet of Lake Erie could survive the loads involved. And if it could survive them, it would create a worse problem by damming the outflow of the lake, which is precisely the 1848 catastrophe, engineered on purpose. What the boom does is subtler. Ice at a lake outlet has a natural tendency, in the right conditions, to form a stable arch across the opening, a self-supporting jam that holds the rest of the pack back and lets the river run clear underneath. That arch forms unreliably. The boom's job is to encourage it, to hold the first flows in place long enough for the pack behind them to consolidate and lock, so that the ice stays in the lake instead of feeding continuously into the river. And when the load exceeds what the boom can hold, when wind and current pile enough ice against it, the boom is designed to let ice pass over the top. The pontoons submerge. Ice goes into the river. This is not a failure mode. It is the design. A barrier that could not shed load would tear out its anchors, and then there would be several kilometers of steel and cable loose in a river with power intakes in it. The honest description, then, is that the ice boom reduces and delays the delivery of ice into the Niagara. It does not stop it. In a hard blow, ice goes over the top and down the river exactly as it did in 1938, and everybody responsible for the structure will tell you so. How often does that happen? Often enough that it is unremarkable to the operators and shocking to everybody else. Take a Sunday afternoon in February 2018, which produced one of the clearer demonstrations in recent memory. Steady, strong wind over Lake Erie generated a seiche of the kind described earlier, the lake physically tilting under the pressure of the air moving across it. Gauges recorded the water at the Buffalo end rising by close to 4 feet, while at the western end, at Toledo, the level dropped by about the same amount, and the whole redistribution happened in a few hours. The boom did not merely let ice over the top that day. It broke. Sit with those numbers rather than skimming them. 4 feet of extra water at Buffalo means the pressure head at the head of the Niagara River has changed substantially, and it means everything floating at that end of the lake has been shoved toward and above the top of the boom. 4 feet less water at Toledo at the same time means part of the western end of a great lake was, briefly, not there. Docks stood in mud, and the extra pressure at the Buffalo end, with the wind still pushing, was enough to part a steel barrier built specifically to take that load. That is the scale of the machine operating on the supply side of this river, and it responds to wind, not to schedules, which brings the whole apparatus of control into focus. 2 countries have built over a century a treaty, an international board, a control structure with 18 gates, tunnels through bedrock, generating stations among the largest in North America, a seasonal barrier at the lake outlet, and a monitoring regime. And the total effect of it is to manage the distribution of whatever Lake Erie decides to send down the channel that day. The gates can pass more or less water to the falls. They cannot refuse a seiche. The boom can hold back a moderate pack. It cannot hold a gale. Ice cover on Lake Erie has become markedly more variable in recent decades, which cuts both ways for this system. A mild winter produces less ice to manage, and it also produces more open water for wind to work on, and less chance of a stable ice arch forming at the outlet, which means what ice does exist is more mobile. The operators plan accordingly. They do not pretend to have removed the variable. And there is a whole half of this river that the control works never touch at all, which is everything below the drop. People treat the falls as the ending. It is not the ending, it is the middle. Below the cataracts, the entire river is compressed into a gorge a few hundred meters wide with vertical walls, and it still has a substantial part of its total descent left to spend before it reaches Lake Ontario. Water that has just fallen 50 meters into a plunge pool comes out of that pool and runs downstream into a channel far too small for it. And the result, a couple of kilometers below the falls, is the Whirlpool Rapids, a stretch where the whole river stands up in standing waves several meters high and runs at speeds comparable to the water above the crest. It is rated at the top of the International Whitewater Scale, which in practice means it is not run. Then the gorge turns. At the Whirlpool, the river hits a sharp bend where an older buried channel meets the modern one, and the flow cannot make the corner cleanly. It piles into the basin, rotates, and leaves through an exit that is not where it came in. That rotating basin is deep and slow-looking from above, and it holds things. Anything the river carries into it, timber, ice, debris, bodies, can circle there for a long time before the current releases it downstream. And here, the diversion reaches even into that. At full flow, the water entering the basin turns counterclockwise and leaves past the natural outlet. When the flow drops, at night, out of season, with a larger share of the river going to the turbines, the balance changes and the whirlpool turns the other way, clockwise. A pool of water big enough to swallow a ship quietly reversing its direction because operators several kilometers upstream have changed how much water they are sending down. That is the reach of the 20th century engineering here, and it is also a good demonstration of its limits. The works can change the direction the whirlpool turns, and they cannot make the gorge survivable. The Hill family measured exactly how unsurvivable, across 2 generations, and the second half of it is not a happy story. William Hill Sr., the man on the ropes in 1918, went on working this river for another 20-odd years, pulling out the living and recovering the dead, and died in 1942 at 54. His wife believed the river and the war between them had worn him out. His sons grew up in that trade. On 5th of August 1951, his son William Hill Jr., 38 years old, went over the Horseshoe Falls in a craft he had built himself. 13 heavy inner tubes, lashed together with canvas webbing and wrapped in fish netting. He called it the Thing. He was not an amateur thrill seeker in the usual sense. He had been on and in this river all his life and had done rescue and recovery work in the gorge himself, alongside his father. He believed with reason that he understood this water better than almost anyone alive. The Thing came apart. What went over the crest was a bundle of rubber and netting, and what surfaced in the lower river afterwards were pieces of it. His body was recovered the following day. Thousands of people had come to watch from the banks, and the men who had spent 2 generations pulling other people out of this river had, that afternoon, nothing whatsoever to offer. 33 years after his father crawled out on ropes above the Cascades and talked 2 strangers off a barge, the same water took the son. And none of it, not the gates, not the boom, not the treaty, touches the mechanism that stranded the scow crew and would go on stranding people for another century. The water above the crest being physically unenterable. The control structure did not make the Cascades gentler. It made them consistent. And consistency, on a summer weekend in an American recreational boom, looks like an invitation. By 1960, the Upper Niagara had a population on it that would have baffled the men on the 1918 scow. Not dredge crews and tugs, families. The post-war years had put small, outboard-powered boats within reach of ordinary wage earners, and the upper river above the falls, wide, sheltered, warm in summer, lined with launch ramps and picnic areas and cottages, with Grand Island sitting in the middle of it like a park, was a superb place to use one. People fished, people water skied, people took visitors out for an hour to see the river. They were not doing anything reckless by the standards of the time or by the standards of the water they were on. For kilometers upstream of the falls, that river genuinely is a mild recreational waterway. The danger is not distributed evenly across it. It is concentrated in a zone, and outside the zone, the risk is close to zero, and inside it, the risk is close to total. And the boundary between them is not marked on the surface of the water by anything a person can see. What actually separates a family in a small boat from the head of the Cascades is not distance and not skill. It is the engine. The whole safety system, stated plainly. In a current running at several kilometers an hour through the pool, a small boat's ability to be anywhere other than downstream is entirely a function of a motor continuing to turn a propeller. Oars are not a backup in a current like that. A person rowing a small boat can make headway against still water, and can make almost none against a river that is already moving faster than they can row. An anchor might hold on the right bottom, and will not hold on smooth rock at speed. The bank is reachable only if you have propulsion to reach it. So the practical question for anybody on the upper river is one that most people never think to ask. If the motor stops right now, how much river is left between me and the point where nothing can be done? On 9 July 1960, the answer for one small aluminium boat was about a mile. The boat belonged to James Honeycutt, a 40-year-old man who worked for one of the power projects and knew the area. With him that afternoon were two children he knew through their family, Deanne Woodward, 17, and her brother Roger, 7. The boat was a small, open aluminium craft. Sources differ between 12 and 14 feet. Which tells you something about how quickly the record of an ordinary afternoon gets written, with an outboard motor of about 7.5 horsepower on the transom. 7.5 horsepower is enough. That is the thing to understand before judging anybody. It is a perfectly conventional motor for a small boat on a river like that, capable of pushing the craft upstream at a comfortable pace, capable of crossing the channel, capable of everything asked of it on a normal day. Thousands of identical outfits were on the water across the Great Lakes that weekend. Both children were wearing life jackets. Honeycutt was not, which was entirely typical of adults at the time, and which had no bearing on what followed. They ran downstream in the afternoon, in the broad water. About 1.6 kilometers above the brink, a mile, a distance which in a boat with a working motor is nothing at all, 3 or 4 minutes of easy running to be somewhere else entirely. Honeycutt turned the boat to head back upstream. That is when the engine quit. He looked at it and found the propeller pin had sheared. That component deserves a sentence, because the entire remainder of this story is contained in it. A shear pin is a deliberately weak piece of metal. In many outboards of that era, a small steel pin through the propeller shaft, designed to break if the propeller strikes something solid, so that the impact destroys a part worth pennies instead of the gearbox and the crankshaft. It is a safety device. It works by failing on purpose. Whatever the sequence in the last few seconds, the outcome was one thing: no drive. The boat, in that instant, became exactly what the 1918 scow had been, an unpowered object of modest mass in the upper river, with people aboard, above the rapids. Honeycutt did what any competent boatman does. He tried to restore propulsion, and when that failed, he went for the oars. Rowing was never going to work, and the reason is arithmetic rather than effort. A fit adult rowing a small aluminium boat can sustain something in the region of 4 or 5 kilometers an hour in still water, in good conditions, for a short period. The current in that stretch of the upper river runs at several kilometers an hour before it starts to accelerate. And the acceleration begins well upstream of the visible white water. Rowing directly upstream is therefore not a plan. At best, it slows the drift. Rowing across, toward the American bank, is the only rational objective, and it requires covering hundreds of meters of lateral distance, while the river carries you toward the head of the rapids at a rate that increases the entire time. He rowed for the shore. He was aiming at the correct target. The mathematics of the situation had already resolved itself before the first stroke. Two things happened as they were carried down, and the order matters. The first is that the river's character changed under them. What had been a smooth surface began to develop the standing waves and broken water of the Cascades, and a small open aluminium boat in that water does not remain a boat for long. It swamped and capsized, and all three of them were in the water, Deanne and Roger in life jackets, Honeycutt without one. The second is that they were now separated. Three people in fast-moving broken water being carried on slightly different lines, at slightly different speeds, into a river a few hundred meters wide, with an edge across it. Deanne was carried toward the Goat Island side, close to the point where the island divides the horseshoe from the American Falls. There were people on the island? It is a park. It was July, and by that stage a considerable number of them had realized what they were watching. A man named John Hayes, a truck driver from New Jersey who was there as a tourist, went over the railing at the edge and out onto the wet rock at the brink of the falls. That is a decision worth stating precisely. A visitor with no equipment, no training, and no rope climbed past the barrier at the top of a waterfall onto ground that is polished, sloping, and wet, in order to be in a position to reach a stranger going past. He got her by the fingers. Accounts put the position at somewhere around 6 meters from the brink, 20 feet, with the current pulling. And then Hayes started to slide, because of course he did. A man leaning out over flowing water holding the full weight of another person against a current has nothing to brace against on wet rock. The rescue was about to convert one victim into two. A second man, John Quattrochi, got hold of Hayes and anchored him, and between them they hauled Deanne Woodward out of the Niagara River at the top of Niagara Falls. She lived. She had been in the upper rapids for several minutes and came out at the last possible point on the last possible line, held by two civilians who happened to be standing in the right place and decided to climb a railing. Honeycutt and Roger were still in the river, further out, in the main flow toward the horseshoe. James Honeycutt went over the falls and was killed. His body was recovered days later. He was 40 years old, and the significant thing about his death is that nothing he did that afternoon was wrong. He took a boat he knew onto water he knew, with an engine that was adequate, in good weather, with the children in life jackets. A pin worth a few cents failed, which is exactly what that pin exists to do, and the failure put him in a place where competence stopped being relevant. Roger Woodward, 7 years old and wearing an orange life jacket, went over the Horseshoe Falls. Everything about his survival comes down to which of the two falls he went over, and that distinction is not luck of the trivial kind. It is a difference in the physical structure of the two drops that governs every single incident at this site, and almost nobody knows it. Underneath the horseshoe, there is a plunge pool. 50-odd meters of falling water has been excavating the rock at the base of that cataract continuously, and the result is deep water directly below the crest. Estimates of it range from about 35 meters to more than 50, and the argument over the exact figure matters far less than the fact that it is water rather than rock. A body arriving there arrives into water, driven deep by the descending flow, in a dense, aerated, violent environment, and then, if the flow releases it, it comes back up. Underneath the American Falls, there is a mountain of broken rock. Successive collapses of the cap rock, including a very large one in the 1950s that dumped an enormous mass of stone at the base, have built a talus slope that reaches a substantial way up the face. Water arriving there does not fall into a pool. It lands on boulders. So the horseshoe is survivable, in the narrow statistical sense that a small number of people have survived it, and the American Falls is, for practical purposes, not. Two cataracts a few hundred meters apart, separated by an island, with completely different outcomes for the same event. That fact will matter again in this story. In a car, in December, 61 years later, Roger surfaced in the plunge pool below the horseshoe, in the churn, in the mist, still in his life jacket. And here the rescue geometry finally works in someone's favor. For one reason. Below the falls, there is water that a vessel can operate on. The Maid of the Mist 2 was on the river that afternoon, doing what it did every 20 minutes all summer, carrying passengers in oilskins up toward the base of the horseshoe into the spray, and then turning back. It was a purpose-built tour boat with real power, operating in a stretch of the gorge where a competent crew can hold position and maneuver. It was, at that moment, the only vessel anywhere in the Niagara system that could physically get to a person in the water. Accounts of exactly how the crew came to look for him differ, whether they were alerted from shore or whether the sighting came from the boat, and it is not necessary to resolve that to see the sequence. The crew spotted a small figure in an orange vest in the water below the falls, brought the boat to him, and threw a life ring. The first attempt did not connect. On the second, he got hold of it and was hauled aboard. Roger Woodward was taken to hospital with relatively minor injuries and became the first person known to have survived a fall over the horseshoe without a barrel or any other protective craft around him. 3 people entered the water within a few minutes of each other. One was pulled from the brink by 2 tourists who climbed a railing. One went over the falls and was picked up by a tour boat. One died. The variable that separated those outcomes was not preparation, decision-making, courage, or equipment. It was position. Where in the width of a river a person happened to be when the water stopped being negotiable. That is the third hard rule, and it is the most uncomfortable one. Above the falls, the outcome is decided by geometry, and the geometry is decided minutes earlier by something you had no control over. Roger Woodward has spoken about it many times over the following decades, and one thing he has consistently emphasized in interviews is worth repeating because it cuts against the way this story is normally packaged. He does not describe a miracle. He describes a man who died trying to get 2 children to shore, and 2 strangers who put themselves over a railing, and a boat crew who got a ring to him on the second throw. The survival was assembled out of other people's actions. Now, what changed after 1960? Publicly, a great deal of attention. The story ran everywhere. Photographs of Deanne being pulled from the water and of a small boy in a hospital bed went around the world. Operationally, the honest answer is, the fundamental exposure did not change, because it could not be changed by anything anyone was willing to do. Consider the available options for preventing a repeat. You could close the Upper Niagara to recreational boating entirely. An enormous, unpopular restriction on a river that is perfectly safe for kilometers, imposed to protect against a failure mode in the last 2 of them. You could build a physical barrier across the river above the Cascades, a structure that would have to withstand the full force of the flow plus ice in a channel hundreds of meters wide, and which would be overtopped or destroyed by exactly the conditions that make it necessary. Or you could rely on signs, buoys, patrols, education, and the good judgment of people who mostly have no idea what the water in front of them is capable of. What exists today is the third option, refined. Warning signs, marked exclusion zones, booms and buoy lines protecting the power intakes, park police, and river patrols, public information. It is not nothing, and it prevents incidents constantly in ways that never get reported because nothing happens. And there is a deeper reason the exposure cannot be engineered away, which becomes obvious the moment you stand at the crest. The entire value of this site is proximity. People do not travel here to see a waterfall from a viewing platform 400 meters back. They come to stand at the top of it, close enough to be rained on by their own view, close enough to put a hand out over water that is about to fall 50 meters, separated from it by a stone parapet and a metal rail of very ordinary height. Both countries built their parks on that premise more than a century ago and have never seriously revisited it, because revisiting it would mean destroying the thing being visited. The design accepted, from the beginning, that millions of people a year would be placed a few meters from the most unforgiving water on the continent, with a barrier calibrated to stop an accident rather than an intention or a fall. That is a deliberate trade, made openly, renewed every year by every agency involved, and it is defensible. The alternative is worse, and the accident rate at the railings is remarkably low. It also means the pool of people who could conceivably end up in that river is not a handful of boaters. It is the visiting population of one of the busiest attractions on Earth. But the structure of the risk is untouched, and it produces the same event decade after decade with different equipment on top of it. Something with people in or on it loses propulsion, or control, or grip above the cascades. The current does the rest, which raises the question that ought to have an obvious answer in a modern city and does not. If it keeps happening, and the geometry never changes, and everybody involved has known about it since 1918, what exactly is the rescue service that responds? The answer turns out to be considerably more improvised than anybody would like, and it took until 2019 for the people doing it to say so out loud. Start with the thing that makes the modern situation different from 1918, and it is not equipment. It is frequency. People end up in the upper Niagara River far more often than the public realizes. Some go in by accident. A slip on a wet wall, a swimmer misjudging the pool upstream, a boat problem, a vehicle leaving a road. Some go in deliberately, which is a long and painful part of this place's history, and is not the subject here. What matters operationally is that the emergency services on both banks respond to people in that water on a regular basis, and that the river treats every one of them identically regardless of how they arrived. That means the fire departments, park police, and Coast Guard units around Niagara Falls are not dealing with a once-a-generation freak event. They are dealing with a recurring operational problem in the fastest large river current in the region, at the top of a 50-meter drop, several times a year. So what does a rescue in that water actually consist of? Swiftwater rescue as a discipline has a hierarchy that every trained team learns in the same order, and the order is deliberately cowardly. Reach first, extend something from the bank. Throw second, a rope bag, thrown, so the person can grab it. Row third, get a boat between them and the hazard. Go last. A rescuer enters the water, and this is the option that gets rescuers killed, which is why it sits at the bottom of the list. The reason is a number that most people have never had explained to them, and it changes how you look at every river you will ever see. The force that moving water exerts on an object rises with the square of its velocity. Double the current speed, and the force does not double. It roughly quadruples. Water moving at a walking pace against a person's legs is an inconvenience. Water moving at a brisk running pace against a person's torso, pinning them against a rock or holding them against a rope, exerts forces measured in hundreds of kilograms, far beyond what any human being can push against, and far beyond what any number of people hauling on a line can simply drag them out of, which is why a tethered rescuer in fast water is in genuine danger rather than being made safe by the rope. The rope stops them going downstream. It does not stop the water, and the water now has a fixed object to work on. A swimmer on a tight line in strong current can be forced under the surface by the flow and held there by the very thing meant to protect them. Trained teams manage this with quick-release harnesses, angled taglines, upstream spotters and boats, and even with all of that, entry into the water is the option of last resort. Now apply that to the upper Niagara, where the current in the Cascades runs at something like 10 times walking pace over irregular rock with no eddies and a 50-meter drop a few hundred meters downstream, and the picture resolves: reach and throw are your options. Row is available only in limited places at limited times. Go is not a technique here. It is a category error. On 7th November 2019, a 59-year-old man went into the river above the American Falls and managed to get hold of a log in the water and hung on. By the time anyone reached him, he had been in that water for close to 2 hours. Everything about that situation is worse than it sounds. A log in a current is not a raft. It is a floating object subject to the same forces, capable of rolling, capable of moving on without warning, and it is not attached to anything. It bought him time and nothing else, and time in that stretch of river is measured in a few hundred meters of remaining distance. 2 city firefighters went out to him and did the correct thing with the tools they had. They got a flotation device onto him, which is to say they solved the buoyancy problem, the thing that kills people in cold water within minutes, and they solved it out in the current rather than from the safety of the bank. And getting buoyancy onto him mattered more than it sounds, because of the clock that runs on a body in cold water and has nothing to do with drowning in the ordinary sense. Water in the Niagara in early November is cold enough to do 3 things in sequence. Cold water physiologists teach it as a rough rule rather than a stopwatch. The numbers vary with the person and the water, but the order never changes. The first response is immediate. Sudden immersion in cold water triggers an involuntary gasp and a period of uncontrolled rapid breathing that lasts around a minute. A gasp underwater is how a substantial share of cold water deaths actually happen, and it occurs before fear or fatigue has had any chance to contribute. Get through that, and there is a window, commonly put at something like 10 minutes, during which the hands and arms still work well enough to do anything useful. Grip fails first because the body shuts down blood flow to the extremities to protect the core. After that, a person may remain conscious for a considerable time and be entirely unable to hold on to a rope, a log, or a rescuer. It is the same failure that killed a 17-year-old on a rope over the gorge in 1912, and it is why securing a flotation device to somebody is a fundamentally different act from handing it to them. Attached buoyancy keeps working after the hands stop. Then the man fought them off and broke free. That is the detail most retellings drop, and it is the one that matters, because it breaks the assumption underneath every rescue plan ever drawn. The firefighters had reached him, they had hold of him. And a rescue is not a transaction that concludes the moment a responder arrives. It requires the person in the water to cooperate with people they may not want near them in the worst minutes of their life, in a river that gives nobody time to negotiate. He broke loose, and he was back in the current, and now everything the department had brought was behind him. At this point, the whole apparatus of the 21st century, the fire department, the state park police, radios, vehicles, a city on each side, 12 million visitors a year, was reduced to the same problem as 1918. A person in the water, moving toward the brink, with no vessel able to intercept and no swimmer able to follow. The thing that saved him was not equipment. Major Clyde Doty of the New York State Park Police and Niagara Falls firefighter Aaron Malmstrom got to him and physically took hold of him, roughly 75 yards from the edge of the American Falls. 75 yards. Call it a football pitch's width of river left. At the speeds involved in that stretch, that is a margin measured in a small number of seconds. The man lived. Everyone who went into the water after him lived, which is the second point worth pausing on, because a grab like that at that distance is an act that can very easily produce 3 casualties instead of 1. And then the Niagara Falls Fire Department did something that most emergency organizations, in most countries, do not do after a successful rescue. It went public and said it had been doing the job wrong. Fire Captain Jason Caffarella, describing what that rescue had exposed, put it about as bluntly as a serving officer can. They had always done it with the wrong equipment and with 0 training. Not inadequate training. 0. Firefighters had been going to the edge of the fastest water in the region with general-purpose gear and improvising repeatedly for years because the calls kept coming and somebody had to answer them. And the equipment failure was not vague. The suits they had were cold water wetsuits. Buoyant, warm, entirely sensible for pulling someone out of a lake in November. Buoyancy in a rapid does the opposite of what you want. It lifts a rescuer's feet off the bottom, and the moment your feet leave the rock in moving water, you stop being someone standing in a river and become another object in the current. The gear designed to keep them alive in cold water was actively working against them in fast water. Think about the sentence that produces a waterfall recognized on site almost everywhere in the world, drawing millions of visitors a year with a documented history of people in the water going back to the 19th century, and the municipal response into the second decade of the 21st century was competent people using the wrong kit and their own nerve. It is not a story about lazy officials. It is a story about how hazard funding actually works. Specialist swift water capability is expensive. Dry suits, helmets, rescue-specific personal flotation devices with quick-release harnesses, throw bags, rope systems, inflatable rescue boats, and, the largest cost by far, continuous training for a team that must stay current on skills they use a handful of times a year. Municipal budgets fund what generates constant, visible demand. A capability required a few times a year, in a city with a limited tax base, sits at the bottom of the list until something forces it up. The 2019 rescue forced it up. The department decided that year to build a proper swift water team. It did not have one until the autumn of 2023. The delay was not indifference. The pandemic shut down the state training courses, and a swift water team is not a purchase order. It is 8 firefighters spending the better part of a week at the state's training site at Oriskany, in classrooms, and then in an artificial rapid, learning to work in moving water without dying in it. Without those courses running, there was no team to stand up. So for 4 more years, in a city built beside the fastest water in the region, the answer to a person in the river remained what it had been in 1918. Whoever was closest, with whatever they had. The right equipment and the trained crews arrived roughly a century after the need for them was first demonstrated on a steel scow. Here is the part that matters more than the equipment, though, and it is the reversal this incident exists to deliver. The new team is a genuine improvement, and it does not change the geometry. Trained swift water technicians in proper gear can do things improvisers cannot. They can set up rope systems faster, hold a line across a channel, work from a boat in marginal water, and above all, they can operate without becoming casualties themselves. What they cannot do is enter the Cascades. Nobody can enter the Cascades. The upgrade improves the odds in the approaches. The pool, the margins, the shallower water near the banks, the stretch where somebody is still catchable, and stops precisely where the 1918 problem began, which means the entire modern rescue system at Niagara Falls, fully equipped and properly trained, is a system for catching people early. It is a fence at the top of the funnel. Past a certain line, the response changes from rescue to recovery, and everybody who works there knows where that line is. There is also a layer of complication here that exists at almost no other rescue site on Earth, and it is drawn on the map in a line that runs down the middle of the river and straight through the Horseshoe Falls. The international boundary is in the water. A person in the Upper Niagara may be in the United States, or in Canada, or may cross from one to the other while drifting, and the agencies that respond are municipal fire departments, state and provincial park police, national police forces, and the Coast Guard of one country only. In practice, the people who work there have built the mutual aid arrangements and the working relationships that this requires, and crews on both banks respond to what they can see regardless of which flag is on the shoreline. It functions. It functions because individuals made it function, not because the geography made it easy. What the geography does make hard is something more basic, and it costs minutes at the only point in the process where minutes exist. When a call comes in about a person in the water above the falls, The first question is not what to bring. It is which bank. The upper river is more than a kilometer wide in places, with an island in the middle of it. And there is no crossing at the falls except by bridge, on roads, through traffic, and an international checkpoint. A team that arrives on the wrong side of that water can see the person they cannot reach, and there is no fast correction available. Callers are usually visitors. They do not know the names of the channels, they may not know which country they are standing in, and the thing they are describing is moving. The modern response, therefore, begins with an information problem in a place where the information decides everything, and the clock that governs it is the one running downstream at 40 kilometers an hour. There is one more capability that has changed, and it is the one that closes the oldest loop in this story. In 1918, help had to come from above, and above meant a roof and a rope. In 1912, it meant a bridge and a rope. The thing that has genuinely changed since is that above now includes aircraft. A helicopter can hold position over moving water. It does not care about the current, the rock, the standing waves, or the aeration. It can lower a rescue swimmer on a cable to a specific point and lift a person vertically out of a place no boat can reach and no swimmer can survive. In the pure geometry of the Niagara problem, a person in unreachable water with a limited number of seconds, it is the first tool in 100 years that answers the actual question. So the last real barrier before the brink, the thing that finally beats a river nobody can enter, is a machine that arrives from the sky, provided it can get there in time, provided the crew on duty is the right kind of crew with the right kind of aircraft, provided the weather over the gorge lets an aircraft fly at all. On 8 December 2021, all three of those conditions were tested at once. A car was in the river above the American Falls, not near the river, in it. Witnesses saw a car go into the water that morning and called 911. And by the time any one official was looking at it, the sedan had been carried down by the current and had come to rest on the rock shelf roughly 50 yards above the brink of the American Falls, sitting in the flow in plain view of a city, half submerged, on a December morning. 50 yards. Half the length of a football pitch of white water between a passenger vehicle and a drop onto the talus pile. The fall with the mountain of broken rock at its base, the one that is not survivable. The first problem was the most basic one imaginable, and it consumed the opening phase of the response. Nobody knew whether there was anybody inside. That question governs everything. If the car is empty, this is a recovery job for a contractor with a cable to be done carefully at a time of the responder's choosing. If somebody is in it and alive, every minute matters, and the risk calculation for the responders changes completely. And the car was in a place where no one could get close enough to look. The windows were wet, the light was flat, the spray was constant, and the vehicle was sitting in a current no one could wade, boat or swim. Rescue crews worked the problem from the bank and could not reach it. Worth remembering where the calendar sat that morning, the city's own swift water team was still 2 years from existing. The people on that shoreline were the same service that had admitted, after the log rescue, that it had been doing this with the wrong equipment. That is not a failure of the team. It is the upper rapids doing what they have done to every rescue attempt since 1918. The current between the shore and that vehicle was not negotiable by any means available on the ground. So they flew a drone. There is something quietly historic about that detail, and it deserves more than a passing mention. The single hardest constraint at Niagara for a century has been that no human being can occupy the space above that water. A small unmanned aircraft can hold a position over the rapids for as long as its battery lasts, at any height, in any part of the channel, with a camera pointed wherever the operator wants. For the first time in the recorded history of this site, responders could put an eye directly over the hazard zone without putting a person at risk to do it. The drone looked into the car and established that there was an occupant. That escalated everything, and it moved the operation out of the hands of the city and into the hands of the only organization with the right machine, which is where the geography reasserts itself in a way nobody outside the region expects. The United States Coast Guard maintains air stations around the Great Lakes, and the aircraft with the hoist, the rescue swimmer, and the crew qualified to do this particular job was not in Niagara. It was in Detroit. That is roughly 400 kilometers away in a straight line, and more than that by any route a helicopter actually flies, across Lake Erie and the length of southern Ontario or around the bottom of it. Understand what that distance does to the timeline. A request has to be made and accepted through the proper channels. A crew has to be briefed and the aircraft prepared. Then somebody has to fly a helicopter for well over an hour, in December, to arrive at a scene where the outcome may already have been decided hours earlier. That is the actual meaning of rescue distance at Niagara Falls in the 21st century, and it is worth saying plainly, the specialist rescue asset for one of the most visited waterfalls on Earth is measured in ferry time from another state. The call reached the air station around 12:30. As it happened, the crew were lifting off anyway that afternoon for a training flight over Lake St. Clair, which is to say the aircraft was already turning, already crewed, already the best-case version of this response. And they turned east instead. Remember that when the timings arrive. This was the fast version, and when it arrived, it met the hazard that makes this site different from every other hoist job on the Great Lakes. The Horseshoe and the American Falls generate mist continuously, enormous volumes of it. Water broken into droplets by a 50-meter fall and carried upward by the air, the falling water drags with it. On a summer day, it is the thing that soaks the tourists on the boats. In December, in air below freezing, it is something else entirely. It is a supply of supercooled liquid water droplets suspended in the air directly above the scene of the emergency. Supercooled droplets freeze on contact with a surface. That is the whole mechanism of aircraft icing, and it is one of the oldest killers in aviation. Ice accreting on an airframe adds weight, changes the shape of lifting surfaces, and destroys their efficiency. On a helicopter, it is worse than on an aeroplane, because a helicopter's lifting surfaces are its rotor blades, and rotor blades are thin, fast-moving, and unforgiving. Ice on a rotor blade does not merely add mass. It disrupts the airflow that generates lift, and because it never accretes evenly, it puts the rotor out of balance while it is turning at several hundred revolutions per minute. The crew watched it happen. The pilot and the flight mechanic kept an eye on the fall's mist coating the aircraft while they worked, and afterwards the pilot made the point that decided the shape of the whole operation. In one flat sentence, a lot of bigger planes have de-icing capabilities, but we don't. So the aircraft that flew 400 kilometers to be the last barrier before the brink was, on arrival, on a clock of its own. Hovering over the crest of a waterfall in freezing spray, accumulating ice on the parts that keep it in the air, with a limit on how long it could stay that was set by the weather and not by the mission, which forced a decision that is easy to state and horrible to make. The drone had established that somebody was in the car. It had not established and could not establish whether that person was alive. A camera, looking through a wet window at a seated figure in a vehicle in spray, produces an image, not a medical assessment. And the rule that every rescue service on Earth operates by is that you do not write somebody off from a distance. Until the condition of the occupant is known, the operation is a rescue, and a rescue justifies risk that a body recovery does not. So the crew had to fly the profile that a live casualty would require, put a person down onto that car at the brink in icing conditions, on the assumption that there was someone in there to save. The actual anatomy of the delay in a case like this is worth laying out in order, because the public version of a rescue skips almost all of it. Somebody has to see the problem and report it. Local units have to respond, reach the shoreline, assess, and establish that their own capability cannot close the distance, which at Niagara is a conclusion nobody wants to reach quickly, and which takes time to reach honestly. Then the request has to go up and across to an agency with the right aircraft and be accepted. The crew has to be assembled, briefed, and launched. The aircraft has to physically cover 400 kilometers. On arrival, the crew has to survey a scene nobody has flown before that day, work out where the aircraft can hold without putting rotor blades into spray-borne ice for longer than it can tolerate, and set up the hoist. Only then does anybody get lowered. Every one of those steps is necessary. Not one of them can be skipped. Add them together, and the elapsed time from the first phone call to a human being touching that car is measured in hours, in a place where the distance involved is 50 yards. A little before 2 in the afternoon, they put a rescue swimmer down on the vehicle, aviation survival technician Darian Duryea, on a cable, in an orange dry suit and helmet. Consider that job for a moment, because it is the single most extreme thing any human being does in this story. A person is lowered from an aircraft that is itself under icing pressure into the spray, onto a car resting on rock in a current, running at the head of a waterfall, 50 yards from the edge, with the noise of the falls making voice communication impossible and everything under his feet wet and moving. He had to work his way in through the passenger side, against the flow. If the car shifts while he is on it, the car goes over the American Falls, and so does he unless the hoist takes him first. He reached the occupant, a woman in her 60s. She was already dead. The recovery was completed, and the aircraft came off the falls. The identification took time, and investigators did not immediately establish publicly how the vehicle came to be in the water. The circumstances remained under investigation, and that is where the account should be left, because filling that silence with speculation would be both unfounded and unkind. What can be stated is that a woman died in a car in the Niagara River 50 yards above the American Falls, and that no organization on either side of the border possessed the means to reach her from the ground. Now put the 2021 operation next to 1918, because the comparison is the point of this entire story, and it does not resolve the way anyone expects. In 1918, 2 men were stuck 600 meters above the brink. The response involved a tug, a line-throwing gun, a powerhouse roof, a breeches buoy, and a local riverman crawling out on ropes in the dark, and it took most of a day, and both men lived. In 2021, 1 person was stuck 50 yards above the brink. The response involved trained swift water teams, a drone, a helicopter with a hoist and a rescue swimmer, and a 400-kilometer transit, and the outcome was determined before any of it arrived. The technology between those 2 dates changed almost everything about how the problem is approached, and almost nothing about the problem. The river between the responders and the casualty was the same river, doing the same thing, for the same reason, in the same place. Every solution developed in 103 years was a solution for reaching across that water without entering it, because entering it has never once been an option, and still is not. That closes the oldest question in this account. Rescuers cannot use the water. They could not in 1918. They cannot now. And the entire apparatus that has grown up here, the ropes, the bridges, the boats below the falls, the trained teams, the drones, the aircraft, exists to work around a few hundred meters of river that remains, in operational terms, a void. And it leaves one thing to account for: the other loop, the one about what the river is carrying and what decides it. Because on 31st of October 2019, 2 years and a month before that car went into the water, the Niagara answered that question itself in the most direct way available to it, using the one object that had been sitting in the rapids as a witness since the day the whole pattern began. That autumn, The Great Lakes were carrying an extraordinary amount of water. After several wet years, the system had risen to levels at or near the highest in the modern record, and Lake Erie, the shallow one, the Waikiwa, the Shalmine, and Bishalorn, the one that responds fastest to everything, was sitting high. A lake that is already high has less room to absorb what the wind does to it. On the night of 31st October 2019, the remnants of Tropical Storm Olga came through with gusts over 50 miles an hour and drove water the length of that lake. The eastern basin went up. Gauges at the Buffalo end recorded a surge of the kind described earlier in this account. The entire body of water leaning downwind, piling against the shoreline, and into the head of the Niagara River, which is the only place the extra water can go. 600 meters above the horseshoe, that surge reached a rusted steel hull that had been sitting on the same shoal since the summer of 1918. The scow moved. It did not go over. It spun, rolled onto its side, and traveled about 50 meters downstream before catching again. One end measured later at 33 meters closer to the falls, the other at 43. Niagara Parks confirmed it in daylight, and the drone footage from the following days shows something that had been a fixed landmark for 101 years, lying at an angle it had never lain at before. 101 years of ice runs, floods, droughts, gales, and the constant working of the current. And the thing that finally shifted it was a night of wind on a lake 30 kilometers away. That is the entire system, demonstrated on a single object. And it is worth assembling now in the order the pieces actually operate, because the order is what matters. Geography sets the constraints, and here the constraints are unusually simple and unusually severe. 4 of the 5 Great Lakes drain through one channel. That channel loses 99 meters between 2 lake surfaces, and it does it in 58 kilometers, with a 50-meter step near the end. The floor of the channel is hard rock, so the river cannot smooth its own profile into something gentler over human timescales. It can only cut backwards, slowly, leaving a gorge behind it. Above the step, the water is wide, deep, and slow. In the last 2 kilometers, the cross-section narrows and the bed drops. And the flow that was moving at a stroll is compressed and accelerated to something no human being can outswim, over shallow rock that fills it with air and takes away the buoyancy people rely on, without ever knowing they rely on it. There is no shelving bank in that stretch, no eddy, no refuge. This produces a zone, several hundred meters wide and a couple of kilometers long, in which no person, boat, or rescuer can operate, and it sits immediately upstream of a fatal drop. Weather activates the constraints, and it does so from 30 kilometers upwind. The volume in the channel is not a property of the river. It is delivered by a shallow lake aligned with the prevailing wind, and that lake tilts. It can pile a meter of extra water against its own outlet in a matter of hours, or drain the far end into mud, and it can shove the winter's ice into the river mouth in bulk or hold it back for weeks. The engineering answer to that, a treaty, an international board, 18 gates, tunnels, generating stations, a seasonal boom at the lake outlet, is genuinely impressive and manages only the distribution of what arrives. Nobody regulates the wind over Lake Erie. Human motive creates the exposure, and the motives here have never been exotic. Men dredged a channel in 1918 because power stations needed clear intakes. Families put small boats on the upper river in 1960 because it was a warm, wide, pleasant stretch of water in front of their houses. Millions of people come every year to stand at a railing above the crest because it is one of the great sights on the continent, and the railing is a few meters from water that has killed everyone who has ever been swept past it in the wrong place. There is no recklessness required in any of that. The exposure comes from the site being genuinely useful and genuinely beautiful, and only locally lethal. Equipment sets the available choices, and at Niagara the margin between ordinary use and catastrophe has repeatedly turned out to be a single component: a tow line, a shear pin the size of a nail, a grip on a rope with cold hands, a log. Above the Cascades, propulsion is not a convenience. It is the only thing standing between a vessel and the drop. And when it stops, everything downstream of that moment is decided by where in the river's width you happen to be. Distance restricts rescue, and this is where the modern era produces its sharpest irony. This is not a remote place. There is a city on each bank, fire departments minutes away, police, hospitals, bridges, hydro plants staffed around the clock, and a visitor count that all but a handful of national parks would take years to match. And the rescue problem is unchanged, because proximity is irrelevant when the intervening space cannot be crossed. Everything that has ever worked here has worked from above: a rope from a bridge in 1912, a line fired from a powerhouse roof in 1918, hands over a railing in 1960, a hoist cable from an aircraft in 2021. And the aircraft that can do it is stationed in another state, 400 kilometers away, and cannot fly through its own icing limits when it arrives. History proves the repetition, and the repetition is the argument. Different centuries, different technologies, different people, same sequence. Something loses the ability to move under its own control in the upper river. The current takes it, and the response is limited to what can be extended across the water rather than sent into it. A barge in 1918, a boat in 1960, a man on a log in 2019, a car in 2021. The equipment on the human side improved enormously across those 103 years. The physics on the river's side did not move at all, and the modern changes alter the timing without touching the system. Diverting half the flow for power has slowed the erosion of the crest, so the falls will retreat far more slowly than they did. The drop will stay roughly where it is, which is a way of saying the trap will stay exactly where it is. Regulation keeps the pool at a steady level, which makes the calm water look even more dependable than it did in 1960. Warmer and more variable winters changed the ice regime, giving less total ice in some years and more mobile ice in others, and less reliable arch formation at the lake outlet, which is not a simple improvement. Drones let responders see into the hazard zone without entering it. Trained swift water teams now exist where improvisation used to be. Every one of those is a real gain, and every one of them operates in the approaches, at the edges, in the seconds before the boundary. Because the boundary itself has never been penetrable by anything. The people who live and work there understand this in a way visitors do not. The park police who patrol the shoreline, the fire crews who train for the calls they know are coming, the plant operators watching gate positions and ice reports, the boat crews who take passengers into the spray below the horseshoe every 20 minutes all summer. On the American side, in vessels that are now battery electric and quiet enough to hear the falls over, none of them treat the upper river as a scenic feature. They treat it as a machine that runs continuously and does not have an off switch, whatever the 1969 cofferdam or the nighttime flow schedule might suggest. At 8 in the morning during the season, gates open on the control structure, and the flow over the crest comes up for the visitors, and the river below the pool becomes, on schedule, twice the river it was at dawn. People arrive with coffee. Boats leave the docks below. Somewhere upstream, the wind over Lake Erie is doing whatever it is doing today, and whatever that is will be here by tonight. And 600 meters above the brink, in water nobody has ever been able to enter, what is left of the scow is still there. It is not one object anymore. The 2019 storm rolled it over. In the spring of 2022, after a winter of ice, Niagara Parks confirmed that the landmark had broken into several pieces lodged separately in the rapids. In November 2025, the bow section, one of the fragments that had come off 3 years earlier, dislodged and moved further down. On New Year's Day 2026, wind and high flow took the main wreck again, and set it down about 160 feet closer to the edge, on its side, still upstream, still not over. Nobody is going to recover any of it. Nobody has ever been able to reach it. The expectation now is simply that the pieces will keep going, a bit at a time, until there is nothing left in the rapids to point at. It is the only thing in that water that ever stopped, and the river is taking it apart in the one place where nobody can go and get it. Everything else that has gone in there kept moving.